In this video, we're going to be talking about genetics and the role that genetics play in our understanding of our biological basis of behavior. So we're going to go through things kind of quickly here. I'm assuming that you still remember basic parts of genetics from your um, biology classes. So go kind of quickly through some of the basic stuff and spend a little bit more time on some of the more difficult concepts. In fact, one of them will be going over in class because I think it's that important for us to have our understanding of that those terms kind of set, ready for us to kind of discuss. So let's kind of just dive right into it. So a couple objectives here. We're going to talk about the different parts of the gene and phenotype and genotype and all of those things, how gene expression works. We're going to talk about how that's related to the nature-nurture debate. We're also going to talk about heritability, which is the most difficult concept in psychology to understand. And that's one that we'll go over in this video, but we're going to spend more time in class talking about it. And then we'll talk about whether or not the brain is an adaptive thing, whether it's an adaptation. So adaptive meaning good for our evolutionary survival. So let's just dive right in to the whole conversation around genes. So every cell in the body has a full set of DNA. That DNA is comprised of many different genes. There's 23 sets of genes, so there's 46 total strands of DNA, or chromosomes, if you will. And you can see them in this photo here. So when we talk about nature and nature-nurture, when we talk about nature, what we mean is our genetic code. What we mean are the biological genetic components that were given to us from our parents, and how they then affect our lives. So you can see how there are two sets of each chromosome. We get one from our mom, one from our dad. You'll also notice that the X and Y chromosomes are the gender, or no, I'm sorry, not the gender, the sex chromosomes, right, that determine male or female. And you'll notice that the X chromosome is significantly larger than the Y. The Y chromosome has been shrinking. We're not really sure why that is, but it has been. Maybe that means doom for us men. I'm not sure. Or I should say us males. So the genes are the building blocks of nature. These are the things that when we talk about nature-nurture, we're talking about the genetic code. So let's talk about what we call behavior genetics. Behavior geneticists are people who study the role that our genes play in our behavior, and by extension, the effects that our environment has on those same actions. So behavior genetics is about understanding the role that genetics play in our actions. Again, it could be they play a little bit, which means that it has a very environmental influence, where they have a lot of it, so that is a smaller environmental influence. Again, remember, nature is genetics, nurture is environment. So when we're talking about nature versus nurture, we need to keep in mind a couple of things. It's not really as separate as it used to be. We used to really think that our genes were one thing, our environment was something else, and that was really it. Now we know that nature provides the framework and nurture determines where which exactly of those things go. So another way to think about it, nature gives us building blocks and nurture determines the order that those blocks are arranged to create us. Isn't that poetic and sweet? This also gets into genotypes and phenotypes and the difference between the genetic makeup and the expression of those genes, which are two different things. And let's kind of dive right into that now. So we know that the genotype is your actual set of DNA. It's the actual sets of chromosomes that you have for each one of your 23 pairs. The phenotype is related more towards the observable characteristics. Okay, so phenotype is really the genetic expression. So a lot of other environmental things play a role in our phenotype. So, for example, your genotype might give you a range of how tall you're going to be, but your environment of the nutrition that you've had, both prenatal and after birth will determine things about how tall you're going to grow. This is because genes must be expressed, right? It's called gene expression, in order to influence observable characteristics. So while every single cell in our body has our full set of DNA, not every cell expresses all those parts of the DNA at the same time. Some cells focus on one type or another, and the rest is just pretty much inactive most of the time. So in gene expression, one of the chromosomes unfolds, stretching out one of the genes. That then is the gene is used as a recipe for creating proteins, which then influence the phenotype. So the gene stretches, right? As gene expression stretches and it changes a little bit, that creates this protein that then creates the phenotype. So that's why your genotype and phenotype could be different, right? So when we talk about gene expression, this is what we're talking about. This is important for us to keep track of because genotype and phenotype have two very different things when we're talking about, say, eye color, right? So we know that eye color is dominant and recessive, right? We have dominant genes, recessive genes. Dominant genes are brown eye color, recessive genes, blue eye color. So depending on your parents, right, you can inherit a brown eye from your mom and a blue eye from your dad. You're going to have brown eyes. But you could also then have a child who has blue eyes because of the recessive genes that follow along. I'm going to give you guys a worksheet that you should do. It's kind of more like a fun puzzle thing that talks about genotype and phenotype related to blood work. That should help give you some practice on genotype and phenotype. This also ties into what we call alleles. So alleles are the individual differences within a gene. So genes, while fairly similar, are not exactly the same person to person. This is what causes slight differences despite having the same kinds of genes. Even a gene like the one that regulates hemoglobin, which is our red blood cells, varies person to person. These slightly different versions are called alleles. Okay. So, for example, here, a certain allele in the hemoglobin cell can turn it from a round shape to what is called a sickle shape, right? It kind of looks like a hammer and sickle, or used for reaping and stuff like that. So the quote unquote normal red blood cell is on the left, and the sickle cell is on the right. This is an adaptation, right? This is something that happens through genetics. Different alleles tend to be passed down in certain families, right? Again, because it's the genetics that you're getting. And people from the global south and Africa, South America in particular, are more likely to have these sickle cells than people from the northern part of the world, Asia and Europe. And part of that actually is because it's actually adaptive. So we've heard of sickle cell anemia, right? Which in this country predominantly affects African Americans. And that's because the sickle cells don't carry iron as well as the rounder hemoglobin cells do. So that causes anemia. But in Africa, the sickle cells are actually a preventive trait to malaria. Malaria has a harder time attacking the body if the cells are not round. So the sickle cell actually provides defense against malaria. So that's kind of this interesting thing so sickle cells kind of developed as an adaptive thing, right? People who had sickle cells were less likely to get sick from getting malaria. But now, especially in countries in the West where malaria is not really a concern, the issue now more is related to iron and nutrition. Anyway, that was kind of a weird tangent there, but the alleles, again, are slight modifications on genes that are different for each person. Okay? So let's talk about heterozygous and homozygous gene pairs. So basically, again, since we're getting our information from our mom and our dad, the alleles that are present can have an effect. Which allele you get from your mom, which allele you get from your dad. There's dominants, negatives, all these other things. So we get one version each from our parents. When the two alleles for the same gene are the same, we call that homozygous, right? Homo meaning similar. So if you receive the curly hair gene from both your mom and your dad, or the straight hair gene from both your mom and your dad, those are homozygous pairs. If they're different, they're heterozygous, which again means opposite, right? Hetero means opposite. And sometimes those alleles will be dominant over others. So again, curly versus straight. Curly tends to be dominant over straight hair proteins, which is why more people tend to have curly or even wavy hair. That's a relationship to these alleles. Okay, so dominant recessive applies to alleles as well. Okay, this is another example of the difference between genotype and phenotype, right? So although the little girl there's phenotype is curly, right? She has curly hair. Her genotype could include an allele for straight hair, right? She could have heterozygous curly hair, which means that she could have a child with straight hair, depending on who the father of her child would be. Okay, so let's talk about heritability. Here's the thing we've all been waiting for. Okay, it's actually pretty easy for us to look at the effect that genes have on a number of different characteristics, right? So we can be talking about eye color, hair, right? There are a number of things that we can look at. But the question becomes more difficult when we're looking for traits. What about our actions, right? What about intelligence? What are these things related to our genetics? Okay. And that's really difficult to look for. So before people can go looking for the different traits or the different alleles that are associated with different traits, we need to figure out, is something related to genetics at all? Which gives us that we have to demonstrate something called heritability. Okay, heritability, and I'm going to give you the definition. Heritability is the proportion of population variability in some characteristic that can be explained in terms of genetic variability. Oh man, what a definition. Okay, it's the proportion of population variability. So the proportion of a difference or differences within a population in some characteristic and something that we're studying that can be explained in terms of difference in genetics. Okay, that's about as good as I can get in terms of a plain English definition here. How do you do this? It's a percentage. So it's the variability due to genetic differences divided by the total variability in the population. Okay, and that percentage gives you the heritability number that we're looking for. Heritability estimates are often made by comparing the extent of phenotype similarities in identical twins raised together versus those adopted and raised apart. Okay, so twin studies are at the heart of heritability and at the heart of our genetic behavioral genetics. Because if you have identical twins, which remember, identical twins are genetically similar, they're essentially clones of each other. That the identical twins then have raised apart have very different environments. So any similarities that they have in traits or behaviors is probably because of genetics, right? So that's how that works. Now, something to be very clear with heritability. Heritability does not tell you the percentage of something that is genetic. It doesn't say, oh, intelligence is 60% genetic. It doesn't tell you that, okay? It tells you about populations and the difference within a population of a trait that can be determined by genetics. So let's look at one of the most common pictures that is used to talk about heritability, and it's these plant things. Okay, so imagine in a lab setting, you've got nutrient, whether it's good soil or bad soil, but it's uniform in the soil. You've got uniform lighting, so plants are all getting the same lighting. And you're going to have different plants grow to different sizes, okay? The difference within the size of the plant on each half of the image there, okay? So on the left hand with the taller plants versus the right hand on the shorter plants, the difference between the taller plants and the shorter plants within each pot, okay, within each planted pot is 100% due to genetics. The reason why this plant is taller than this plant is because of genetics, right? The soil is exactly the same, the lighting is exactly the same, and we'll assume that the watering is exactly the same. So the only thing that can explain the difference between the tall plant and the shorter plants is genetics. Notice that the difference between the groups, the difference between this potted soil and this potted soil is 100% environmental. Okay, it's 100% environmental. But you also notice that there's differences within the heights of the shorter plants as well, right? And that difference is also 100% related to genetics. Okay, so remember, when we're talking heritability, we're talking about the percentage that a difference in trait within a population is related to the genetics and not the environment. Okay, so we can't say things like intelligence is blank heritable. That doesn't make any sense. It has to be within a population. The difference of the trait that we're looking at, right? The variance, the variation of the trait that we're looking at within a population, those differences, what is the percentage of those differences that we can attribute to the genetic differences? If it's 100%, then no matter what, then the environment can be exactly the same, and you're going to have all these different things. That's almost impossible to get with humans, by the way, which is why we like to use plants as this image. Most people look at this image and say, oh, okay, heritability. Tall plants, good soil, good lighting. Shorter plants, bad soil, good lighting. That's heritability. No, it's not. That's environmental differences, okay? Heritability, again, within the population, the difference of a trait and its relationship to its genetic code. So the plants, the tall plants, the really tall plants, these guys, were always going to be taller than their neighbors, right? Always, because that's just the way that they are, right? You can actually see that on both sides, that the plants tend to be, right? I'm again imagining this, that this is a little taller than this is a little taller than this. That kind of tracks over here. Right? The difference in the heights of the plants within each pot is 100% because of genetics. That's heritability. And if that's confusing, we will talk about this in class. Also, I'm going to give you guys a worksheet again. It's actually a Schoology quiz that is basically a true or false quiz about heritability that you can take a bunch to hopefully help you understand this concept a little bit more clearly. Okay, and again, the way we usually do this is through twin studies. Okay, remember that identical twins are genetic copies of each other. Okay, what happens is a sperm fertilizes an egg, and then after that happens, something occurs in the woman's body that causes the egg to split into two copies of itself, and that creates identical twins. Notice identical twins have to be the same sex. They are genetically the same. Fraternal twins are when the woman releases two eggs at the same time. They are both fertilized by two separate sperm, and they can be same or opposite sex, just like any other sibling. Now, fraternal twins, there's really nothing all that special about them. Sorry to the fraternal twins that may or may not be in the class. So, from a psychological standpoint, the only thing that means is that they're going to have a more similar environment than a normal set of siblings would, because they were born at the same time. But from psych's perspective, from a genetics perspective, the identical twins are much more interesting because they are genetically identical. So if you have situations where identical twin was raised in a separate environment, right? That there was twins that were, say, put up for adoption, and one twin went to one family and one twin went to another. You can then study those differences that have occurred and say, you know what, that's probably related to the environment. They probably have these environmental differences. Whereas any similarities that they show are probably related to genetics, because again, they're genetically similar. The only thing different would be their environment. Okay? So again, identical twins have unique environment within them, and they have 100% shared genes. Now, I have some friends that are identical twins, and it took a while, but I eventually learned to be able to tell them apart, right? Even though they look almost identical. Um, and one of them is like a half an inch taller than the other, right? So that is a unique thing that causes a change, right? That shows the role that the environment played for that one twin over the other, okay? So again, when we talk about twin studies, what we're talking about is studying identical twins who are raised separately from their birth families, right? Separate from birth, and that will show similarities. Again, the problem here is that you can't do any experiments, right? These are all correlational studies. Twin studies, by definition, have to be correlational. We can't randomly assign twins, and we also can't randomly assign ethically, all right, you just gave birth to identical twins. We're taking one from you and giving them to this other family. Like, that's really problematic, right? That's really problematic. So the twin studies do show a role of the role that genetics play in our behavior. So let's talk a little bit. I know this video is getting a little long, but let's kind of power through because we're almost done here, guys. So let's power through and talk about mutations. So a mutation is really just an error that occurs when genes are copying itself. So as genes are making copies, sometimes they make mistakes, which then leads to mutations in our genetic code. Now, a lot of times those mutations are very small and have no effect on our lives. Other times, those mutations are life-threatening and cause an individual to either die early or, if it happens in the womb, maybe that there's a miscarriage. But sometimes those mutations are advantageous. And if that mutation is beneficial in some way, that shows that the organism is adapting to the environment, right? That shows that there's some sort of thing, a random change in our genetic code that makes it more likely that we'll survive. More likely surviving means you're more likely to reproduce, which means you're more likely to pass that random genetic mutation on to your children. Expand that over thousands of years and hundreds of generations, you have evolution. You have changes in our genetic code that will eventually lead to different species becoming present based off of their, one, isolation, and two, their ability to adapt to their environment. Okay. A couple of things that I have something there. Some genes provide choices to the organism to change its form. Not all caterpillars turn into butterflies. There has to be the right environmental and genetic components present to allow the caterpillar to transform into a butterfly. It is a self-regulating thing. So if a caterpillar does not reach a certain level of, say, nutrition, for example, then it'll never become a butterfly. It'll just live its life as a caterpillar. Whereas if it does have those specific, if it hits those kind of markers, kind of benchmarks that it needs to, then it can turn into a butterfly. So gene expression, again, plays a role in our evolution. Let's define the term adaptation, okay? An adaptation is a gene-based characteristic held by most individuals, either within a species or a distinctive group, that's due to natural selection. So an adaptation is something that we have because of evolution, right? When we talk about things like something being adaptive, right? When we use that term adaptive, what we mean is that it is beneficial, right? That this was some sort of evolutionary trait that was deemed beneficial by our environment, which allowed us to thrive and survive, okay? Again, adaptations have to be caused by genes, right? This is something else to be focused on. It has to be a genetic characteristic because it's related to evolution, not a nurture thing, not a gene expression, not a phenotype, but it has to be a change in genotype. So the last question here that we're going to wrap up with is the human brain an adaptation? Well, it does look like that it is. It looks like our brain has evolved over time. And all people, all humans today have brains of similar structures and functions for the most part. And we know that the brain is developed because of genes. Any mutation that affects brain development usually results in death. It's very lethal. So our brains are adaptive. Our abilities, complex reasoning, language, our problem-solving abilities are all things that made it more likely that we will survive. And those things are only possible based off of the brain that we have. So, you could argue that the human mind is the most important adaptive thing that has ever happened because it allows us to control our environment and understand. We also can see that the brain grew in size. So the first skull there is, I believe that's an Australopithecus, if I'm putting my World History 1 hat on. And then you have, that looks more like a Homo habilis or Homo erectus. And then finally the Homo sapiens skull. You can see that the size of the brain has just exploded over 100,000 years, or more than that, millions of years. But really, for the last 100,000 years, our brain hasn't grown all that much. In proportion to our body, I should say. We're bigger than we were 100,000 years ago, but in a proportion to our body, our brains are about the same size. So that's bio, that's genetics. Make sure you come to class with questions around all of this stuff. I know there's a lot here, guys, so please come prepared for questions. I'm going to devote a whole class period just to answer what questions you guys might have over this. So please come prepared to talk and to make sure that we're all on the same page going forward for our test in the bio unit. All right, guys, until next time, I'll see you then.